Hello, I'm Burhan Khadbai, Europe editor at The Banker, and today we're looking at the crucial role that digital infrastructure has in supporting the future of digital connectivity. This is the cover story for the January edition of The Banker. With me is Marie Kemplay, Capital Markets and Investment Banking editor at The Banker, who wrote the story. So, Marie, firstly, what do we mean by the term digital infrastructure? How do you define it, and what are some examples?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, actually, because something that became clear during research for the feature is that this really is an area that is evolving in terms of how governments and investors, as well as others, are defining this space. And to kind of state the obvious a bit, in the past, if you were talking about infrastructure, really, you'd be thinking about the movement of physical things. So, whether that's goods or people. Whereas with digital infrastructure, obviously, that is more around supporting the movement of data and the digital economy. And at a basic level, if we think about what core infrastructure will be needed to support expanding digital activity into the future, there are three main categories, I would say, which is mobile phone towers, fiber to supply broadband internet, as well as data centers. And also within those broad categories, of course, you can get into all kinds of different configurations, but that's the kind of headline level stuff. And many people do now compare this infrastructure with, kind of to my point earlier, with roads and rail networks in terms of its importance to the modern economy. And interestingly, also, there are some people that suggest that this is an area that's going to continue evolving. So, what we define as core digital infrastructure today, that might broaden out into the future. So, because obviously we hear now a lot of talk around things like smart cities and electric vehicles, and that all those kind of technologies requires a whole new layer of infrastructure and support systems to be put in place as well. So this is an area that is likely to continue evolving as well. So yeah, on the face of it, sounds relatively straightforward, but there's a lot going on there if you kind of scratch beneath the surface a bit.
Okay, great. I suppose the pandemic has accelerated demand for this area, but why is this such an important area of focus, and is it going to become an even bigger area of focus going forward?
Yeah, so a number of points here, and you're absolutely right. If it wasn't clear enough, before the pandemic, how intrinsic digital activity was in the global economy, obviously it's even clearer now. And of course, over the long term, we're all keeping our fingers crossed that we will hopefully at some point see the back of this pandemic. But the behavioural changes that it has brought, such as increased remote working or increasing reliance on e-commerce in place of people going to physical shops. Those changes aren't going anywhere. That's only going to accelerate. And interviewees I spoke to for this feature spoke around networks experiencing 25% to 50% year-on-year increases in traffic, in recent years, and they expect that to continue. So clearly, the infrastructure needs to be put in place, and there needs to be additional investment in infrastructure put in place to keep up with that continuing demand and continuing acceleration and increase in data usage. Policymakers globally have also recognized that good digital connectivity is going to be essential for economic prosperity as well. And this is relevant both for developed economies. We can think about the differences between, cities and rural areas, even within, as I say, developed economies. But it's also very important when you think about digital inequalities between different global regions as well, because digital connectivity could be added to the list of areas where emerging market economies could easily fall behind, more developed economies if there isn't that investment put in place to ensure that they are able to access the same services that people in more developed economies are. And one of the interviews I spoke to put this really nicely when thinking around during the pandemic. It was really, if people were in lockdowns, if they didn't have access to good quality internet, their kids weren't able to continue having their school lessons, people weren't able to continue working. It's a pretty stark divide there.
And how has the financing of this area evolved?
Yeah, so in line with kind of earlier comments that I made, this is an area where a number of people have told me it's increasingly, so if we're talking about infrastructure focused investors, this is increasingly regarded to them as a core part of what they do, in the same way as they would regard transport or energy as kind of key strands to their investment strategies. And this area of the market has been evolving and becoming more kind of stable. And also in response to the wider low rate environment, it is increasingly appealing to some extent to, pension funds and insurers and other types of investor who might be looking for steady returns. as well. So, I mean, I don't want to paint a picture that you've got masses of investors kind of piling in here, but it is the appeal is growing, and a broader number of people are interested in it. I think it's fair to say there is still some further maturing to happen as well. One bank interviewee explained to me that this is still an area where a lot of project financing type structures are heavily used. So in a lot of cases, it is still banks that are driving that initial investment. But he expects that in the near future, certainly for existing projects and existing infrastructure particularly with established and proven cash flows, this is an area where standard bond financing actually might be on the cards pretty soon as well. So certainly an interesting area to keep an eye on.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Marie. A very interesting topic which will be explored in the January edition of The Banker and on thebanker.com.